Welcome to Romance Files. Please like this video and subscribe to Romance Files. We're grateful for each and every one of you. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's begin. The laughter caught Mark's attention. It wasn't the first time he'd heard Emily giggling over something on her phone, but today it felt different. As he stood at the kitchen sink watching her from across the room, there was a glow on her face, a kind of radiance he hadn't seen in a while. "Something funny?" he asked casually, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. Emily glanced up, her eyes flickering with surprise before softening into a smile. "Oh, just a silly meme from work," she replied, locking her phone and placing it face down on the couch. Mark nodded, though a small pang of unease lingered. He told himself it was nothing. Emily had always been outgoing and friendly, her phone a constant source of communication with friends and colleagues, but something in her tone didn't sit right. Later that evening, as they sat together watching a rerun of their favorite sitcom, Mark noticed her phone light up. Emily snatched it up quickly, typing furiously before setting it down again. "Who's that?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Oh, just Sarah from work," Emily said, not meeting his gaze. Mark didn't push. He'd always prided himself on being a trusting husband. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the knot in his stomach refused to untangle. In the weeks that followed, Emily's behavior grew harder to ignore. She became increasingly protective of her phone, keeping it with her at all times, even taking it into the bathroom. She started working late more often, blaming a new project at the office. "They're really piling it on," she'd say with a weary smile, kissing him on the cheek before heading out. Mark wanted to believe her. He told himself she was just stressed, that work was demanding, but the signs were too glaring to dismiss. One evening, as Mark cleaned up after dinner, he noticed Emily stepping outside to take a call. He watched through the window as she paced the patio, her voice low and urgent. When she came back in, her smile was strained. "Who was that?" he asked. "Just my manager," she said quickly, rushing past him. Mark's unease deepened. He started paying closer attention, watching for any clue that might explain her odd behavior. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Emily had gone upstairs to shower, leaving her phone charging on the kitchen counter. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the device. He knew it was wrong, an invasion of her privacy, but the knot in his stomach had grown unbearable. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked her phone. Her passcode hadn't changed. The messages hit him like a freight train. "Daniel, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." "Emily, same here. I wish we could have stayed longer." Mark's hands trembled as he scrolled through the thread. The texts were filled with flirtation, inside jokes, and references to late-night meetups. There were pictures too, selfies of Emily with Daniel, laughing together in what looked like a hotel room. His chest tightened as he pieced together the timeline, her late nights at work, the sudden secrecy, the guarded phone. It all made sense now. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking my video. Mark set the phone down just as he heard the water stop upstairs. His heart pounded as he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't confront her, not yet. That night, Mark lay in bed beside Emily, his mind racing. Every smile she gave him, every casual touch felt like a cruel mockery. He thought about the years they'd spent together, the vacations, the holidays, the moments of laughter and love. How long had this been going on? How could she do this to him? The next morning, while Emily was still asleep, Mark began his investigation. A quick search revealed Daniel's social media profile. He was a colleague of Emily's, just as Mark had suspected. But what he didn't expect was the discovery of Daniel's wife, Rachel, and their 2 young children. Mark stared at the pictures on Daniel's profile, a perfect facade of family happiness. A Christmas photo of Daniel and Rachel holding their children, a beach vacation snapshot. The betrayal wasn't just his, it was Rachel's too. Mark spent the next few days in a haze of anger and heartbreak, but beneath the pain, a cold resolve began to take shape. He wouldn't confront Emily directly. Not yet. That would give her the chance to deny, to twist the narrative. No, he needed to be smarter. He decided to reach out to Rachel with a simple message on social media, polite and nonchalant. "Hi Rachel, I'm Mark, Emily's husband. I was wondering if you'd like to join us for a neighborhood gathering we're hosting. It'd be great to meet you and your family." Rachel responded warmly, thanking him for the invitation and confirming their attendance. Mark's plan was set in motion. In the days leading up to the gathering, Mark worked tirelessly to prepare every detail, not just the physical arrangements, but the psychological landscape he was crafting. Emily was eager to help, blissfully unaware of his intentions. She flitted around the house with bright energy, choosing decorations and planning the menu. It was almost ironic how much effort she was putting into her own downfall. Don't miss out on the journey to 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button now and be part of something big before everyone else. "Are we inviting anyone from my work?" Emily asked one evening as they reviewed the guest list. Mark hesitated, giving her a practiced casual smile. "A few people. It'll be nice to mix things up." Emily nodded, seemingly satisfied, but Mark caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. He wondered if some part of her suspected he knew. The night before the gathering, Mark couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the messages he'd read, the pictures he'd seen. He thought about Rachel, how she'd smile warmly when she arrived, completely unaware of what was happening behind her back. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about exposing Emily and Daniel. It was about justice, for himself, for Rachel, and for every lie they both endured. The morning of the barbecue dawned bright and clear, a perfect fall day. Mark woke early, his chest tight with anticipation. Emily joined him in the backyard, arranging flowers on the tables and chatting about how nice it would be to have everyone over. Mark watched her, his expression carefully neutral. By midday, the backyard was ready. String lights crisscrossed above the tables, and the grill was prepped with an array of food. Guests began arriving in twos and threes, filling the yard with laughter and the clink of drinks. Mark played the part of the gracious host, greeting neighbors and old friends, his easy smile masking the storm brewing beneath. Then he saw them. Rachel and Daniel entered the backyard hand in hand, with polite smiles on their faces. Daniel looked every bit the picture-perfect suburban dad, but there was tension in his eyes. Rachel, by contrast, was warm and genuine, dressed in a simple sundress that swayed as she walked. Mark greeted them with a wide smile, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "Glad you could make it," he said, his tone deceptively friendly. Daniel's grip faltered for a moment, his eyes darting to Emily, who stood frozen near the grill. Mark caught the subtle shift in her expression, a flicker of panic, before she forced a smile and waved. The game had begun. Mark subtly guided Rachel and Daniel to a central table, ensuring they were seated with other guests from Emily's workplace. Emily avoided Daniel's gaze, her laughter growing more forced with each passing minute. Throughout the afternoon, Mark moved through the crowd with precision. He engaged Rachel in friendly conversation, asking about her children, her hobbies, and her family life. She spoke warmly of Daniel, her love and pride shining through her words. It made Mark's stomach churn, but he kept his composure. Meanwhile, Emily was unraveling. She kept glancing at Mark as though trying to gauge his mood. Daniel, too, was growing increasingly tense, his laughter strained as he stuck close to Rachel. At one point, Mark caught Emily cornering Daniel near the drinks table. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces too close for comfort. Mark approached them, his voice casual but sharp. "Everything okay over here?" Emily flinched, her hand tightening around her drink. "Oh yes, we were just talking about work." "Work?" Mark repeated, his tone loaded with implication. "You know Emily's been putting in a lot of late nights for work lately. She's mentioned how busy things have been." Daniel paled, and Emily's eyes darted to the ground. Before either of them could respond, Rachel joined them, slipping her arm through Daniel's. "What are we talking about?" she asked brightly. Mark smiled. "Just work stuff, but I was just telling Daniel how lucky he is. It's rare to balance work and family so seamlessly." Daniel coughed, nearly choking on his drink. Emily turned an alarming shade of red while Rachel beamed, oblivious to the tension crackling around them. Mark savored the moment. As the sun began to set, the lights overhead cast a warm glow on the backyard. Guests were relaxed, laughing and chatting over dessert, but beneath the surface, the tension was electric. Mark could see Emily's hands trembling as she picked at her plate. Daniel avoided looking in his direction while Rachel chatted happily with a neighbor. Mark stood, raising his glass. The soft murmur of conversation quieted as guests turned their attention to him. "I just want to take a moment to thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady and composed. Emily looked up sharply, her smile faltering. "It's not often we get to gather like this, and it's a reminder of how important community is, how important trust is, in friends and family, and in marriage." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Emily froze, her eyes widening. "And sometimes," Mark continued, "discover things that challenge that trust, things that force us to reevaluate who we can rely on." The air grew heavy with tension. Emily's face drained of color, and Daniel's grip on his beer tightened. Mark turned to Emily, his gaze piercing. "Emily, do you want to tell everyone here about your late-night meetings with Daniel, or should I?" The silence was deafening. The world seemed to pause. Every eye turned toward Emily, who sat frozen in her chair. The vibrant chatter and laughter that had filled the backyard moments earlier were replaced by a suffocating silence. Mark stood tall, his glass still raised, his gaze locked on his wife. He didn't need to say another word. The weight of his accusation hung heavy in the air. "Mark," Emily's voice cracked as she struggled to speak. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rachel, seated next to Daniel, frowned in confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between her husband and Emily. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't know what I'm talking about, Emily? Shall I spell it out for everyone here?" He turned to Rachel, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Rachel, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but your husband Daniel and my wife have been having an affair for months." The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs. Rachel's face went pale as she stared at Daniel. who looked as though he might bolt at any moment. "What?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "Daniel, tell me he's lying!" Daniel stammered, his face flushed. "It's not what it seems." Mark slammed his glass down on the table, the sound silencing everyone. "Not what it seems?" he spat. "I have the texts, the photos, the hotel receipts. Do you really want me to go into detail?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Daniel. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice rising. "After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you, this is what you do to me." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was answer enough. Emily shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete. "Mark, please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Let's talk about this privately. You don't have to do this here." "Oh, but I do," Mark said, his voice cold and cutting. "You didn't care about privacy when you were sneaking around with Daniel, so why should I spare you now?" The crowd murmured again, neighbors and coworkers exchanging shocked glances. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed unable to tear their eyes away from the unfolding drama. "Rachel," Emily said, turning desperately to Daniel's wife. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake," Rachel snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "A mistake is spilling coffee on someone's desk. A 6-month affair isn't a mistake, it's a betrayal." Emily crumpled into her chair, sobbing, while Rachel turned her fury back to Daniel. "How could you do this to me, to our kids?" "I'm sorry," Daniel said weakly, his shoulders slumping. "It just happened." Rachel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "It just happened? That's the best you can come up with?" Mark stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "For months, I've been watching these two lie and cheat, thinking they could get away with it. And now, I think it's time they face the consequences." Emily looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "Mark, please, I love you. We can fix this." "Fix this?" Mark repeated, his voice hard. "You destroyed our marriage the moment you decided to betray me. There's nothing left to fix." The tension in the yard was unbearable. Rachel stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted you, Daniel. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." "Rachel, wait!" Daniel pleaded, reaching for her arm, but she shrugged him off. "Don't you dare touch me," she hissed before storming out of the yard. The gate slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a final verdict. Daniel stood awkwardly, his face red with humiliation. He looked around at the crowd, but no one met his gaze. "I should go," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "You should," Mark said coldly, stepping aside to let him pass. As Daniel shuffled toward the gate, the neighbors began to disperse, some offering Mark awkward pats on the shoulder or murmured words of sympathy. No one spared Emily a glance. Soon, the backyard was empty, save for Mark and Emily. She stood by the table, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling. "Mark," she began, her voice small. "We're done," Mark said, cutting her off. "You made your choice, Emily. Now you get to live with the consequences." Without another word, he turned and walked into the house, leaving her standing alone in the dark. The following days were a blur of whispers and fallout. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood, and Emily became a social pariah. Friends avoided her, and coworkers gossiped about her behind her back. Rachel filed for divorce almost immediately, cutting all ties with Daniel. She focused on her children, finding strength in her role as a mother. Mark, too, began rebuilding his life. He filed for divorce from Emily, purged their home of shared memories, and threw himself into work and hobbies he'd neglected for years. Months later, Mark sat on his back porch, a cold beer in hand. The house felt lighter now, free of the weight of Emily's lies. He thought about Rachel, about her resilience and strength. They'd spoken a few times since the barbecue, finding solace in their shared pain. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark raised his bottle in a silent toast, to truth, to resilience, and to a future unburdened by betrayal. Meanwhile, Emily sat in the empty house, staring at the packed boxes around her. It had been a month since the barbecue, and everything in her life had crumbled. Mark had filed for divorce within days, and their friends had quickly distanced themselves from her. She had tried reaching out to Mark several times, begging for forgiveness, but he remained cold and distant. The last time she had visited the house to talk to him, he had barely acknowledged her. His gaze was like a wall, impenetrable and indifferent. Even her family, who had once adored Mark, struggled to look her in the eye. At work, whispers followed her everywhere. Daniel, too, was avoiding her, unwilling to face the consequences of their affair. He had been transferred to another department after HR caught wind of the scandal, and Emily's own career felt precarious. She opened her phone, scrolling through old pictures of her and Mark, vacations, anniversaries, quiet moments on the couch. She wondered when it had all gone wrong. She wondered if there was any way to turn back time. Rachel stood in the doorway of her children's bedroom, watching them sleep. Their faces were peaceful, oblivious to the storm that had ripped through their lives. She had thrown herself into being the best mother she could be, attending every soccer game, every school event. But in the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and the house was still, the pain crept in. Her nights were filled with memories of Daniel, the man she had once loved, the father of her children. She replayed their happiest moments, now tainted by his betrayal. But Rachel wasn't one to wallow. She started therapy, finding strength in unpacking her feelings and setting boundaries. She joined a support group for single parents, forging friendships with people who understood her pain. One evening, she received a message from Mark. "How are you holding up?" Rachel hesitated before responding. "Some days are better than others. How about you?" Mark replied quickly. "The same. Let me know if you ever want to talk." For a moment, Rachel stared at her phone, wondering what it might be like to meet Mark again. Not as the husband of the woman who destroyed her marriage, but as someone who understood her pain. Mark stood in the middle of his freshly painted living room, surveying the changes he'd made. He had gutted the space, stripping away every trace of Emily's influence, new furniture, new decor, and a new beginning. His days felt lighter now, though the nights were still heavy with memories. He thought about the moments when he and Emily had been happy, when their love had felt unbreakable. He had loved her deeply, trusted her completely, and it had almost destroyed him. But now he was rediscovering himself. He had taken up woodworking, spending hours in the garage crafting furniture. It was therapeutic, losing himself in the rhythm of sanding, cutting, and building. One afternoon, as he worked on a new coffee table, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" Mark stared at the message, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like that," he replied. Months after the barbecue, Mark and Rachel sat across from each other at a quiet cafe. The initial awkwardness quickly gave way to a comfortable rhythm, their shared experiences creating an unspoken bond. "I'm glad you reached out," Mark said, stirring his coffee. Rachel nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I think I needed to talk to someone who really understands what it's like." They shared stories of their healing journeys, their frustrations, their hopes for the future. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a connection that wasn't weighed down by betrayal. As they parted ways, Rachel hugged him briefly. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Mark watched her walk away, a warmth blooming in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. Emily's attempts to rebuild her life were met with failure after failure. She had tried reaching out to Daniel, hoping for some semblance of the connection they'd shared, but he wanted nothing to do with her. Her coworkers treated her with thinly veiled contempt, and her once bright career seemed to stagnate. Even her family gatherings were strained, the weight of her choices hanging heavy in the air. One evening, she sat alone in her tiny new apartment, staring at the divorce papers Mark had sent over. She had delayed signing them, clinging to a sliver of hope that he might change his mind. But as the days turned into weeks, Emily realized that hope was futile. Mark was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. On a crisp spring morning, Mark stood on the porch of his home, sipping his coffee. The air was fresh, the world alive with possibility. He thought about Emily, about the life they'd shared, and the betrayal that had ended it. There was a time when he thought he'd never recover, but now he felt a sense of peace. His phone buzzed, and he smiled as he saw a message from Rachel. "Want to go for a hike this weekend?" Mark replied, his smile widening. "I'd love to." As he stepped inside, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to it.